The Civil War was one of the bloodiest American battles to date and cost the lives of over 640,000 Americans. Its overall impact on the nation can be felt in both the northern and the southern parts of the country. One of the most interesting aspects of the Civil War is Sherman's march to the sea in 1864. This campaign was a declaration of total war against the people of Georgia and South Carolina particularly. His troops left behind a path of destruction from Atlanta to Savannah. As Sherman's troops marched through Milledgeville, Georgia, they took and destroyed more than just arsenal and industry. They destroyed the ways of gender relations in the Old South. Southern women were the quiet strength of the Confederacy and the noble heroes of American women for generations to come. The women displayed their commitment to the war in the way they stepped into the roles their husbands left behind, their defense of their property during Sherman's march, and the lasting legacy they leave inspiring many still today. Once their fathers, husbands, sons, and brothers left for the battlefields, women in the South became the directors of plantations, businesses, and farms all across the South. They took leading roles in the everyday business of the Confederacy in order to maintain it. The women also kept the Confederate soldiers clothed and fed during the war. There were societies of women whose sole purpose was sewing the uniforms and knapsacks for the soldiers at war. Southern women cooked and raised money for the Southern troops. The Confederacy was disadvantaged in terms of supplies and financial support once they were cut off from the North, so the women would direct fundraisers and collect donations in order to fund the war efforts. They opened their homes to soldiers of the Confederacy who were passing by in order to ensure them a good meal and a place to sleep. The women eventually had to make uniforms and blankets out of whatever they could find, so they began cutting and sewing together pieces of carpet and draperies along with their own clothing and dresses in order to make supplies that were needed. This newfound importance began to twist the Victorian ideologies of domesticity that defined the roles of women in the antebellum era. The women of the South began to take over the roles that were previously held by their male counterparts. Lower-class women of the South had to take over their husbands' positions in the field and perform hard labor typically done by men in order to keep their families financially afloat. One of the most important roles the women were eventually placed into is that of a nurse. Typically, in the pre-war time, a nurse was a role dominated by the men of the country because it was seen as unladylike for a woman to see the grotesque and bloody aspects of the medical profession. Ladies like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was known as the Angel of the Battlefield, would come to reshape the field of medicine into one that women could not only be a part of, but that they could become leaders in. Before the war, a woman's pride was in her home and the way she kept it. Southern ladies were especially seen as the domesticated counterpart to their husbands. They were in charge of the upkeep of the house and the clothing and feeding of the family. Once the war was in full swing, the role of women was challenged and they started to be contributing members of society outside of the home. They began voicing their opinions about politics and the war efforts in ways they never had the opportunity before. The role of the woman became so important that it eventually led to the declination of traditional female roles in the South. In no way is it more obvious that the women were changing into members of society that were extremely strong and defiant than during Sherman's march to the sea. General William T. Sherman led troops on a march through Georgia using a total war ideology that crippled the state of Georgia. Once his troops captured Atlanta, they moved on to other cities and towns in Georgia in pursuit of the state capital of Milledgeville. Southern accounts of Sherman's march include stories of his destruction and damage done to the towns that stood in his path. His 65,000 troops were divided into 2 wings with 2 corps each. General Oliver Howard commanded the right wing, while General Henry Slocum commanded the left wing. Sherman personally traveled with the left wing to Milledgeville. General Slocum's troops were the first to march into Milledgeville on November 22, 1863. Enthusiastic black slaves who saw the arrival as a sign of their long-awaited freedom greeted them. Three days prior to the initial arrival of the Union cavalrymen, Governor Joe Brown and the legislature of Georgia met to deliberate on the impending invasion. The governor initiated a draft of all white men ages 16 to 65 to join the fight. He also pardoned 150 of the 200 prisoners at the state penitentiary to join the militia. Almost immediately after being pardoned, the prisoners set fire to the penitentiary. After the legislature concluded on November 19th, Governor Brown ordered the evacuation of Milledgeville, including himself. He sent state legal documents to safer places throughout the county and the state. He then took possessions from the governor's mansion and boarded the last train to Macon. There are still criticisms regarding the flight of the governor and how it affected the overall success of Sherman's march, especially the capture of Milledgeville. During their brief stay in Milledgeville, the Union troops flew up Arsenal, burned the bridge over the Oconee River, and ravished the state capitol building. The troops held a mock legislative meeting and a fictitious funeral for the governor, Joe Brown. Union soldiers looted local stores and plantations, and they also burned church pews from St. Stephen's Episcopal Church as firewood. As a final blow, the troops poured molasses down the organ pipes of the church, which were said to have never played the same again and eventually had to be replaced. Only one civilian, Patrick Kane, died during the defense and seizure of Milledgeville. He was working on the Jarrett plantation and attempted to defend it, but ultimately lost his life. The women of the city were extremely worried and afraid when they heard that Sherman was heading for Milledgeville. Their concerns can be seen in their diary entries from the days preceding the arrival of Sherman. Anna Maria Green was the daughter of Dr. Thomas Green, the superintendent of the Georgia Lunatic Asylum in Milledgeville. She expressed her shame and disappointment in the Georgia legislatures for their handling of the impending invasion of the Union troops. A similar account of the Union seizure of Milledgeville comes from Dolly Lunt Burge. Mrs. Burge was the widow of Thomas Burge, a wealthy slaveholder. She hid valuables and protected her plantation and slaves in the face of the Union occupation. These are just a couple of wartime stories of the defiance and courage of the Southern women against the invasion of Sherman's troops. They are also portrayals of how women in the South were growing more confident and breaking free of the traditional gender roles of women in the 19th century. The women saw Sherman's march as a personal attack against everything their husbands, brothers, fathers, and sons were fighting for. In order to protect and preserve the customs of the Old South, these women were risking their livelihoods to do their part in the war. As the lines of traditional gender roles were being crossed, the women were seemingly successful in the defense of their property, which gave them a sense of self-assurance. Southern white women realized that they no longer depended heavily on the protection of their male counterparts, particularly because they had no choice in the matter. For the first time in their lives, they were able to have a voice against the Union invasion of the South and the political sphere of the Civil War. The campaign of Sherman's March to the Sea made staunch female supporters of the Confederacy even more sure that they were supporting the right troops in the war. It made the women want to help the Confederate troops even more. As the war waged on and Sherman's troops were long gone, the women left in his wake were beginning to grow weary. The troops had ransacked and stolen much of their food supplies and labor. The women were left to fend for themselves and provide for their already discouraged families. Working-class women of the South wrote letters of desperation seeking the aid of Governor Brown and the Confederate government. They were starving and growing more and more poor every day. Eventually, towards the end of the war, the Confederate government sent some relief to needy families across the South in the form of food and sometimes financial aid. One personal account of the conditions in Milledgeville comes from Eliza Frances Andrews, who was the daughter of a Georgia Superior Court judge. She traveled through Milledgeville 3 weeks after Sherman's troops had advanced onward and left the city. The real lasting impact of women on the Civil War can be felt after the last cannon was fired. Women all over the South shared the same disappointment and heartfelt loss as the soldiers who had fought in the war. Their pride and honor for the Confederacy helped to invent the lost cause ideology. The women knew that all of their hard work and sacrifice had not been labored in vain and must not be remembered as such. They had lost husbands and sons, not to mention the material possessions and other physical artifacts destroyed during the war. The end of the war also signaled the beginning of new gender roles and relations. Once their men returned home, they found stronger and more secure women than the ones they had left behind. Women in the South began societies to bring aid to veterans of the Civil War, particularly Confederate veterans, which would eventually become known as the Daughters of the Confederacy. They also began to create support groups for widows of Civil War veterans. They implemented educational sectors of schools in the South that were dedicated to the history and preserving of the Old South ideologies and triumphs in war. Southern women played an integral role in the Confederate livelihood. They were the invisible soldiers of the war, and the women of the South faced Sherman's troops and showed their unwavering support of the Confederacy in a way never before seen. Their support came in many forms, but it's undeniable that it had longer-lasting effects still being felt today. These women saw America through its darkest days and still serve as an inspiration to women all across the country today.